Hi everyone. So this week I'm off camera, but mostly because I want to show you how to do something that you're going to need to know how to do. So what I'm about to teach you today is called an objective summary. So when you are working in um, on academic works rather, a lot of times you are going to have to implement works or have explanations of works or work within or around concepts that are present within the works of other scholars. So, as a result of that, you're going to need to be able to work through a reading of someone else's work and ensure that you have a good understanding of what that scholar says in their journal articles or their books or chapters that they have in books, etc. Okay, so what I'm going to be helping you work on today is the process by which you can create an objective summary of a work. Now, an objective summary is basically where you put together an explanation of what is said by a scholar in your own words and in an exceedingly shortened format, right? So it's a summary, so a shortening of it, and basically it's just what it says, right? It's not whether or not you agree with it, it's not whether or not you think it's correct, it's just basically stating what that person said. Okay. So again, it's not whether you agree, it's not whether you think it's accurate, correct, how you feel about it, or anything like that. It's just presenting a summation of the information. Okay. So for your next paper, the film and lit paper, one of the things that you will be expected to do is to engage with this particular article called What Novels Can Do That Films Can't, and Vice Versa. And it's written by Seymour Chapman. Now, this is kind of an older article, but we'll get into sort of the essence of why we're using this to sort of inform or sort of work why you're going to be working this particular work into your paper in later lectures. But for this particular lecture, what I want to get you started on is that process of how to go about summarizing a fairly chunky article or something like that. So this article is approximately 19 pages long. Of course, it's probably a little bit shorter than that once you figure in like their anything they've cited, and I think fairly certain there are a couple of pictures throughout this article and whatnot. So one of the things that you will want to do is this is a step-by-step process by which you're going to take each paragraph and summarize each paragraph. That's the first step, and that's what we're going to be going over in this particular video. Now, this is a multi-step process, okay? We're just going to be going over step one in today's video, and then I will expect that this week you will finish step one. Step one, we're only going to get through part of it together. You will then be expected to finish out step one. And then when we come back with another video lecture, then that's going to be like a process of going through like step two and beyond. Okay. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is if you have an article like this, obviously we're going to be walking through this together, but this is a process that you can use for pretty much any article, book chapter, whatever, as you are sort of practicing or starting to get into the process of performing or creating an objective summary of a work. So one of the things you'll want to do is you're going to number each paragraph. Now, I have this article in the assignment folder for the next paper, which is the film and lit paper. And I will also have it linked in the week 10 folder for our weekly work folders in Blackboard. So you'll have access to this article in a couple of places. And again, you are going to need to know the contents of this entire article or be familiar with its concepts that it's trying to get across, because you're going to be using those concepts in your film and lit paper. Okay, so be sure to pay attention as we go through this and make sure you complete the steps that are necessary beyond what we go over in the video, because you're going to need to know these things for that paper. Okay, so I've gone through and I've already numbered each of the paragraphs for you throughout this document. You'll see the numbers are off to the side here, okay? In your document, you're going to want to number um, 1 through however many number of um, paragraphs there are. This one actually has 32 paragraphs. So what you would do is come over to your worksheet. Now this worksheet is also linked in the week 10 folder on Blackboard. So you'll be able to download this and so you can complete the work. I will go ahead though, and I'm going to fill in the first 11 or so of these sentences, right? Because we're going to go over some of this, like I say, in this video today. So part of this is going to be completed for you, and then you're going to be responsible for filling out the rest of it on your own, okay? So I'm going to fill it into this worksheet. Once I fill it into this worksheet, I'm going to upload this worksheet with those 10 or 11 or so paragraphs completed, or the sentences for each of those 10 or 11 paragraphs completed, so that way you guys can work off of or beyond the work that was already done in this video. Okay, so let's go back up to the top. I'm going to read some paragraphs to you and then help you sort of determine or kind of see what this process is supposed to be like. So the first paragraph reads, "The study of narrative has become so popular that the French have honored it with a term, la narratologie. Given the escalating and sophisticated literature on the subject, its English counterpart, narratology, may not be as risible as it sounds. Modern narratology combines two powerful intellectual trends, the Anglo-American inheritance of Henry James, Percy Lubbock, and E.M. Forster, and Wayne Booth, and the mingling of Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jacobson, and Vladimir Propp, with French structuralist approaches, Claude Levi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, and Gerard Journet, and Zvetsyn Todorov. It's not accidental that narratology has developed during a period in which linguistics and cinema theory have also flourished. Linguistics, of course, is one basis for the field now called semiotics, the study of all meaning systems, not only natural language. Another basis is the work of the philosopher Charles S. Peirce and his continuator Charles W. Morris. These trees have borne elegant fruit. We read fascinating semiotic analysis of facial communication, body language, fashion, the circus, architecture, and gastronomy. The most vigorous, if controversial, branch of cinema studies, the work of Christian Metz, is also semiotically based. Okay, so this is the first paragraph, right? So basically, what you want to do is create a one-sentence summary of what appears in this paragraph. So if we were going to come over to our worksheet then and try and summarize that, we might say something like, provides background on approaches to cinema studies and its scholarly predecessors. Okay, so I'd say example, narratology, semiotics, etc. Okay, and I think I've spelled something wrong. There we go. Okay, so that's my one sentence summary of what is entailed in this first paragraph. Okay, so it's really that simple, and you just kind of go through and you do this over and over again, right? It's kind of rinse, wash, repeat. So let's go over the second paragraph. One of the most important observations to come out of narratology is that narrative itself is a deep structure quite independent of its medium. In other words, narrative is basically a kind of text organization, and that organization, that schema, needs to be actualized in written words, as in stories and novels, in spoken words combined with the movements of actors imitating characters against sets, which intimate places, or imitate places, excuse me, as in plays and films, in drawings, in comic strips, in dance movements, as in narrative ballet and in mime, and even in music, at least in program music, of the order of Till Eulenspiegel and Peter and the Wolf. Okay, so what is going on in this paragraph? Well, what he's basically saying here is that narrative can be found in many different mediums, right? So mediums are things like a play or a radio show or a dance or a book, right? So mediums sort of encompass a variety of different storytelling platforms, basically. So I'm going to write what I put before, which, so narrative can be found in several different mediums. Okay. So now we have our second one there. Okay, so now we're going to go on to number 3. A salient property of narrative is double time structuring. That is, all narratives in whatever medium combine the time sequence of plot events, the time of the histoire or story time, with the time of the presentation of those events in the text, which we call discourse time. What is fundamental to narrative, regardless of medium, is that these two time orders are independent. In realistic narratives, the time of the story is fixed, following the ordinary course of a life. A person is born, grows from childhood to maturity and old age, and then dies. But the discourse time order may be completely different. It may start with the person's deathbed, then flash back to childhood, or it may start with the childhood, flash forward to death, then end with the adult life. This independence of discourse time is precisely and only possible because of the subsumed story time. Now, of course, all texts pass through time. It takes X number of hours to read an essay, a legal brief, or a sermon. But the internal structures of these non-narrative texts are not temporal, but logical, so that their discourse time is irrelevant, just as the viewing time of a painting is irrelevant. We may spend half an hour in front of a Titian, but the aesthetic effect is as if we were taking in the whole painting at a glance. In narratives, on the other hand, the dual time orders function independently. This is true in any medium. Flashbacks are just as possible in ballet or mime or opera as they are in film or novel. Thus, in theory at least, any narrative can be actualized by any medium which can communicate the two time orders. Okay, so now we're getting into slightly more complicated language here, and you'll notice this as you go through your time as an academic. Sometimes journal articles and sort of academically written texts, they're a little bit hard to unpack sometimes. It's like high order language and logic that needs to go into sort of understanding them. And so sometimes you're just going to have to sort of sit back with your text and just try and sort of go through it. Sometimes you might have to read things a couple of times, use sort of context clues to try and figure out what's being said. So if we go back into this, he's talking all about these two different time structures, right? So there's the histoire or story time. And then there's the discourse time. So basically, if we sort of get down to the nitty gritty of this, the story time, right? That's sort of the order of things, how they happened, right? So, from being born to someone's deathbed. The discourse time, though, is different. It can be like sort of rolled around in different ways or presented in different orders, right? And basically what he's saying here, and I think it sums it up pretty nicely actually in his final sentence here, what he's saying is there are two kinds of time when telling a story, right? There's the story as it happened and the story as it is presented. And any medium that has the ability to play with those two sets of time is capable of telling a story. Okay, so let's see if we can get that in sentence form. Oops. So narratives can exist in any medium that has the ability to display both story time, and I'm going to just put here for my own and your own reminder, so actual sequence of events, with, or sorry, and discourse time, which is the story order, not necessarily logical order. Okay, so let's go ahead then, and we're going to go down to, oh, oops, I messed up my ordering here. Okay, so that was number 3. So now we're going on to number 4. So the next paragraph says, narratologists immediately observed an important consequence of this property of narrative texts, namely the translatability of a given narrative from one medium to another. Cinderella as verbal tale, as ballet, as opera, as film, as comic strip, as pantomime, and so on. This observation was so interesting, so much in keeping with structuralist theory, and so productive of further work in narrative analysis, that it tended to concentrate attention exclusively on the constancies in narrative structure across the different media at the expense of interesting differences. But now the study of narrative has reached a point where the differences can emerge as objects of independent interest. So what he's basically saying here is that once narratologists sort of realize that stories can sort of transcend different media, right? It can be told as a radio production, it can be told as a ballet, it can be told as a film, right? It could be the same story like Cinderella, but it can be translated into these different modes of storytelling. So he's saying that once narratologists figured that out, they focused a lot on what stayed the same about the story as it moved from one narrative to another, or excuse me, from one medium to another. But that came at the expense of not sort of looking at how the story had to necessarily change as a result of changing mediums, right? So what's different about a story if it goes from a radio show to a book, for example, right? They focus instead on what was the same between those mediums, not what was different. Okay, so let's see if we can put this in a one sentence form. So let's say past narratological works focused too much on the similarities between adapted works at the expense of recognizing the differences between adapted works in different mediums. Okay. So then we can go down to 5. In the course of studying and teaching film, I have been struck by the sorts of changes typically introduced by screen adaptations, and vice versa, in that strange new process, quote, novelization, end quote, which transforms already exhibited films into novels. Close study of film and novel versions of the same narrative reveals with great clarity the peculiar powers of the two media. Once we grasp those peculiarities, the reasons for the differences in form, content, and impact of the two versions strikingly emerge. Many features of these narratives could be chosen by comparison, but I will limit myself to only two: description and point of view. So basically, what he's saying here is that in looking at films and novels, he found that there are several differences in the way that they present a story. But in this particular essay, he's going to focus on two of those differences, and those being description and point of view. Okay? So we'll say here Chapman describes two differences in the way that film and literature portray narrative. Let's see. Oh, yeah, and then we should probably put the two. Okay, so point of view and description. Okay, so then we're going to go on to number 6. Okay. Critics have long recognized that descriptive passages in novels are different somehow in textual kind from the narrative proper. They have spoken of blocks or islands or chunks of description in early fiction, and have noted that modern novels shy away from blatantly purple descriptive passages. Joseph Conrad and Ford Madox Ford formulated theories of what they called distributed exposition and description, in which he described elements which the described elements were insinuated, so to speak, into the running narrative line. What has not emerged very clearly until recently, however, is a genuine theoretical explanation of novelistic description. The emphasis has been on the pictorial, the imaged. We read in typical handbooks like Thrall and Hibbard, descriptions has as its purpose the picturing of a scene or setting. But that is only part of the story. Such a definition eliminates inter alia, the description of an abstract state of affairs, or the character's mental posture, or indeed of anything not strictly visual or visualizable. Narratologists argue that a more correct and comprehensive account of description rests on temporal structure. As we have already noted, narrative proper requires a double and independent time ordering, that of the timeline of the story and that of the timeline of the discourse. Now, what happens in description is that the timeline of the story is interrupted and frozen. Events are stopped, though our reading or discourse time continues, and we look at the characters and the setting elements as at a tableau vivant. So this sounds a little complicated, but basically what he's saying here is that when you read a story and something is described to you, the story itself pauses for a moment as you take in those descriptive details. So if you read something and it says something like, the old man looked at the schoolyard. It was old and decrepit, and it was clear that no children had been there for many years. It was quiet there, and he sat in his thoughts, right? So we say that we know that there's an old man and he's looking at a school. So that's part of the story, right? That's sort of part of the action of the story, what the man is doing. But we pause for a moment as the school is being described, right? It's decrepit, whatever, but he kind of pauses for a moment in time. We don't know necessarily what the man is doing in that moment or whatever, because the story time has paused in an effort to give us descriptive details in the story or the book, right? So when we're reading, story time stops for a moment as we get descriptive details, okay? So the discourse time continues because we're continuing to read, right? It's still part of the story to us. But the story time in the sense of what is happening to the characters within the story, it has to necessarily pause to give us those descriptive details, right? So basically what he's saying here then is in novels, description pauses the story time or the action while discourse time continues, i.e., we are still reading, right? Okay. So all of that, like I say, it sounds complicated, but that's in essence what he's saying. Okay, so let's go on to number 7. As an example of this process, consider a bit of the short story which underlies a film by Jean Renoir, Maupassant's Un party de campagne, or A Country Excursion. The story opens with a summary of events, which clearly establishes story time. So here, this is what he's saying. For 5 months, they had been talking of going to lunch at some country restaurant. They had risen very early that morning. Monsieur Dufour had borrowed the milkman's cart and drove himself on, and then he gives the French. So there are 3 events, and as we note from the use of the past perfect with had, they predate the opening moment of the story proper. The moment of story now, so to speak, which is the moment named by the expression and drove himself. The story proper begins with the family en voyage, already in the midst of their excursion. The story sequence is naturally ordered. At some point in the past, before the story proper began, someone first mentioned going to lunch in the country. Let's call that event A. The family continued this discussion, thus event A was iterated. Let's call that A sub n, since we don't know how many times that topic came up during those 5 months. Next, Monsieur Dufour borrowed the milkman's cart, presumably the Saturday night before the trip, event B. Then they arose early on Sunday morning, event C. And finally, here they are, driving along the road, event D. Notice incidentally the disparity between the story order and discourse order. Story order is A, B, C, D. Discourse order is A, C, B, D. Okay, so that's paragraph 7. So basically, this is just, in summary, Chapman is providing an example of descriptive or discourse time passages versus active story time passages, right? So that's really all we need to put in our thing here, right? It can just be that simple. So Chapman provides an example of how descriptive discourse or actually I'll put descriptive or discourse time passages, so descriptive passages or discourse time are different than active or story time passages. Okay, so then we can go on to number 8. This first sentence then is straight narration, which takes us out of the expository past into the narrative present. Now, the very next sentence is clearly of a different order. Quote, it, the cart, had a roof supported by 4 iron posts to which were attached curtains, which had been raised so that they could see the countryside. So then he provides the French, because this was a translation that he provided. This is, of course, unadulterated description. Story time stops as the narrator characterizes story object, a prop. The sentence reflects the static character of the passage. The verb to have is clearly equivalent in the typical copula of description. It is not a verb of action and communicates no sense of an event, but simply evokes the quality of an object or state of affairs. Maupassant could have, and more recent writers probably would have, avoided direct description by writing something like, the cart, its roof supported by 4 iron posts, rolled merrily down the street. or the road, excuse me. This active syntax would have kept story time going and would have eased in the characterization of the cart. Maupassant's prose provokes rather the start and stop effect customary to early fiction, a fashion now somewhat dated. Not that the surface verb, the verb in the actual verbal medium, needs to be the copula to be. It could be a perfectly active verb in the strict grammatical sense and still evoke the descriptive copula at the deep narrative level, as in the sentence that immediately follows. The curtain at the back fluttered in the breeze like a flag. And then he provides the French. Fluttered is an active verb, but from the textual point of view, the sentence is pure description. It is not tied into the event chain. The sentence could as easily be phrased, in the back there was a curtain fluttering in the breeze like a flag. Okay, so in sentence 8 here, it's kind of similar to the last sentence in that he's providing an example, right? So Chapman in this paragraph is providing, so he provides an example of descriptive, so or discourse time, passage, or passages really, versus active or story time passages. Okay. And I would probably maybe even add here, just because between the two paragraphs, passages, so which show how these differ in a novel. Okay. Excuse me. So let's go on to 9 here. The paragraph continues with a brief description of Mademoiselle Dufour and makes references to the grandmother, to Henriette, and to a yellow-haired youth who later becomes Henriette's husband. Paragraphs immediately thereafter continue the narrative by citing events: the passing of the fortifications at Port Malo, the reaching of the bridge of Neuilly, the pronouncement of Monsieur Dufour that at last they have reached the country, and so on. Okay, so in paragraph 9 here, I would simply put Chapman continues his example. So I think that's really simply put what he's doing here, right? Or what's happening. So as you can see, like some of these are really going to be simple, like he continues an example, right? What you don't want to do is get into the habit of just being like, this is a continuation. Like sometimes it's going to be, but sometimes if there's something really of some substance that's really important to the overarching message of the paragraph, then you're going to want to make sure that substance is present in the summary that you provide in your sheet here. Okay. So let's go to number 10. Let's consider the opening scene of Jean Renoir's 1936 film version of this story, also entitled Une partie de campagne. Ideally, you would watch the film as you read this essay, but something of the effect, I hope, can be communicated by the following illustrations. The whole sequence introducing the Dufours takes only a minute of viewing time, so we don't have much time to remark the details of their borrowed cart, but looking at a single frame enables us to examine it at our leisure. So then he has like figure 1 down here that he's referencing. Okay, so in this 10th paragraph, basically, he is now pivoting from the story or the written story and pivoting to the telling or the retelling of this story in film format. So we might say something like Chapman pivots to an example from a film version of the novel he has been describing in the paragraphs before. Okay. So then let's go on to, I think this is going to be the last paragraph that we go over together, and then you will be able to go over the rest of this sort of as homework this week. So we can go over the sort of substance of this and finish out the rest of the process of going through an objective summary next week. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on with 11 here. This is a relatively long paragraph, but it'll be okay. We note, for instance, that the cart is absurdly small, has only 2 wheels, bears the name of the owner. I think it's like Chaplain Gervais, I'm not sure what CH stands for, painted on the side, and has a railing on the roof. There is no flapping curtain at the back, but instead some kind of sun shield and so on. Now, these details are apparently of the same order as those in the story. Remember the reference to the roof, the 4 iron posts, and the rolled up curtains. But there are some vital differences. For one thing, the number of details in Maupassant's sentence is limited to 3. In other words, selection among the possible number of details evoked was absolutely determined. The author, through his narrator, selected and named precisely 3. Thus, the reader learns only those 3 and can only expand the picture imaginatively. But in the film, representation, the number of details, is indeterminate, since what this version gives us is a simulacrum of a French carriage of a certain era, provenance, and so on. Thus, the number of details that we could note is potentially large, even vast. In practice, however, we do not register many details. The film is going by too fast, and we are too preoccupied with the meaning of this cart, with what is going to happen next, to dwell upon its physical details. We simply label. We say to ourselves, aha, a cart with some people in it. We react that way because of a technical property of film text. The details are not asserted as such by a narrator, but simply presented. So we tend, in a pragmatic way, to contemplate only those that seem salient to the plot as it unrolls in our minds, and what Roland Barthes calls hermeneutic inquiry. Now, if you think about it, this is a rather odd aesthetic situation. Film narrative possesses a plenitude of visual details, an excessive particularity compared to the verbal version, a plenitude aptly called by certain aestheticians visual oversimplification. And then he provides a German word for that. A property that it shares, of course, with the other visual arts. But unlike those arts, unlike painting or sculpture, narrative films do not usually allow us time to dwell on plenteous details. Pressure from the narrative component is too great. Events move too fast. The contemplation of beautiful framing or color or lighting is a pleasure limited to those who can see the film many times, who are fortunate enough to have access to equipment which will allow them to stop the frame. But watching a movie under normal circumstances in a cinema is not at all like being in a gallery or art museum. The management wants us up and out of the theater so that the 10:30 patrons can take our seats. And even sophisticated moviegoers who call a film beautiful are more likely to be referring to literary than to visual components. Indeed, there are movies like Terrence Malick's recent Days of Heaven, which are criticized because their visual effects are too striking for the narrative line to support. Narrative pressure is so great that the interpretation of even non-narrative films is sometimes affected by it, at least for a time, until the audience gets its bearings. For example, there is a film which presents a sequence of frozen frames, on the basis of which the audience is prompted to construct a story. Then, after the last frame, the camera pulls away to reveal the frames were merely part of a collage of photographs organized randomly. This last shot de-narrativizes the film. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this 11th paragraph, but I think the essence of what he is trying to get across here is that film, in essence, whereas novels sort of stop the story to give description, um, and then the reader has to sort of fill in the blanks. That is not necessarily what happens when we're watching a film, right? Whereas a novel describes things, film just presents it, right? So, whereas a novel only gives us a few minute details, a film presents things sort of in their full glory, right? So, if a filmmaker was taking a novel and wanted to create a film out of it, and there was a description that said, the small doll, right? Well, at some point, that filmmaker is going to have to actualize what that small doll actually looks like, right? And so it's going to have a fulfilled presence for us. It's not going to take it's not going to rely on our imagination to understand what that looks like, right? But also, the film moves pretty quickly. So, if in the context of the book it said something like little Jane played with her small doll, well, in the context of the film, it might show little Jane quickly, throwing her doll here or there, or whatever. It might not even dwell very much on what the doll is, nor might it matter completely what that doll looks like, right? But in essence, it's going to have to take some sort of a form in that film. So, um, I guess really what this comes down to, though, um, to put it into a sentence, I'm actually going to give two sentences because this is like such a long paragraph. Trying as often as possible just to do one, but if it's like really, really long, like this is about a page and a half, almost a quarter of text in this one paragraph, which is really long. So, and it's not even double spaced. So I'm gonna allow two. Let's do in novels. Description stops the action and provides only some detail that the reader must, quote, fill in for what is not provided. So then, in the counterpoint to that, in films, things are not described, but presented to us in a way, in a way that does not stop story time in the same way as novels do. Okay, so story time stops in a novel for description. It does not stop in a film. Okay, so as you go through, so you are going to do 12 through 32. So they're about 20 paragraphs that you are going to try your hand at summarizing yourself, right? So I'll put this in Blackboard as an actual document with these pieces already completed. So that way all you have to do is enter down to 12 to 13, 14, 15, blah, 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 until you get to 32. Now, make sure you have this ready because next week, one of the first things that we're going to do is I'm going to teach you how to complete the process of creating your objective summary, which will, you'll need to have your sentences all filled out and whatnot to continue on into this second phase. Keep in mind, it's going to be important that you actually do these steps because by the time you get into your into your film and literature paper, you are going to need to have a summary of this work by Chapman at your disposal. You're going to have a summary in your paper, essentially, of this article to work into your paper. So it's going to be really important that you complete the steps as we go through this, and get yourself to the point where you have a working objective summary. Okay, so I apologize. I know this video was a long one, but I like to actually go through the process with you a little bit on this, because this is something that many of you probably have not done before. This is going to be sort of a new process for many of you, particularly when you're working with densely worded academic texts like this. Okay, but it's going to be a skill that you're going to want to hone and craft and get better at as you go through your academic life. Because as you go through your studies, you're going to find that you're going to have much more convoluted things that you're reading through and that you'll need to understand, and that you're going to need to be able to sort of put into your own words or summarize. Okay. So I'm going to end this video here. Like I said, make sure you get into Blackboard. Make sure you put together your sentences for each of the paragraphs that are in this particular journal article. And when we come back next week, we're going to finish out steps 2 through completion. The part that takes the most time is this first step. Okay. If you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know. You can either get in touch with me via Microsoft Teams or via email. And yeah, so hopefully this is helpful to you and you get through this relatively easily. I think you will. It'll be a little challenging, but you will be okay, I assure you. Like I said, just let me know if you have questions, okay? Thanks for watching, and I will see you in video form soon. Bye.